Brothers, this is Type-IIx, and welcome to the second episode of Gear, Growth, and Gains. All right, so this week we are going to talk about 4 sections. We'll talk about the update for the new book coming out soon, Bolus. All right, Bolus update. Section number 2, we'll talk about basically stacking of androgens, stacking of AAS. I was asked a really good question by somebody on Discord. I'm going to unpack that for you. We'll talk about why stacking is a benefit and whether it is more or less tolerable, more or less efficacious. Section number 3, we'll talk about why T3 sucks for cutting. I hate this drug. I'll tell you why. And section number 4 will be about MENT's unique effects, right? I just submitted an article to Millet about it. You guys already probably know my opinion on MENT, but this actually spells it all out. And it's not biased. It's just facts. All right, guys. So section 1, let's talk about the Bolus update. That's coming out soon. So basically, my web developer did finish up his work 2 nights ago. Great. And the illustrator sent me her final designs this morning. So this book is going to be ready to go soon. Basically, it's just up to me to arrange it, send preprints to some colleagues and contributors for review, and get it over to an editor for some final editing so it doesn't, look terrible in some places. I'm sure I'm not perfect with grammar, but I try. All right, so that's section 1. So let's move on to section 2. So I was asked a question on Discord by Yvette S, which is, Steve backwards. I think he goes by Steve. How you doing, Steve? So this was on Discord, the Asylum Network. So Steve asked, how does a T cycle solo compare to a T cycle with a bunch of other compounds stacked like Anavar, Primo, NPP, etc.? And is it really necessary if you aren't hopping on stage in the immediate future? So this question is great. This basically hits all the buttons for something that's interesting to talk about for me, and there's a lot to unpack. So let's talk about it. So stacking. All right. So the first thing that we talk about when we're looking at making a decision, right, are the trade-offs, right? And the things that are being traded off and making this decision will be tolerability versus efficacy. So we need to figure out whether stacking as an intervention is more or less tolerable or more or less efficacious. All right, so first, let's talk about efficacy. All right. So when it comes to efficacy, there are 3 strategies of combinations that we can use, okay? So we're going to combine, 2 or more compounds. What we are thinking about, right, are ways that we can leverage the different, basically, manners of combination. So there are 3 additive combination strategies, there are complementary combination strategies, and there are synergistic combination strategies. So let's discuss these and give some examples. So for complementary strategies, these are basically think 1 plus a negative 1 equals 0. These are where effects should middle out. Okay. So for example, combining stanozolol and oxymetholone, Winnie and Roll, right? With these 2, there's a middling out when it comes to the joints. So stanozolol decreases joint cushioning and increases cartilage turnover. It does this by inhibiting synovial fibroblast DNA synthesis and increasing C1 inhibitor, decreases vascular permeability. Yeah. Roll, on the other hand, by its gestogenic effects, basically does the opposite. Okay, so the endpoint is the same, joints, right? And they work by basically the same mechanisms, but in opposite ways. So these 2 are complementary. Let's talk about synergistic examples, right? So test and trend. So with tests, these are going to be synergistic, right? Test and trend. So synergistic, basically think 1 plus 1 is greater than 2, right? These are combinations where the endpoint that's being acted on is the same, but the mechanisms for achieving that outcome are different. In these cases, right, think with muscle growth that there are 2 prongs for muscle growth. There's increased muscle protein synthesis and there's decreased muscle protein breakdown. So those are 2 mechanisms that achieve the same endpoint. Something that acts on one lever and something that acts on the other lever to enhance muscle size are synergistic. So with test and trend, test clearly, right, we know is very good at increasing muscle protein synthesis, but it also decreases muscle protein breakdown, and so does tren. But they do these actually by different pathways. So with testosterone, it increases IGF-1 systemically. With trenbolone, it increases the muscle satellite cell IGF-1 responsiveness, doing more with less, right? Testosterone's 5-alpha reducible, okay? And it therefore supports sexual function in men, unlike trenbolone. You couldn't even take tren alone, by the way. Trenbolone decreases glucocorticoid receptor number in muscle. And it doesn't do all of this by the AR, right? So testosterone is almost all by the AR, except for the fact that it also aromatizes. Trenbolone doesn't aromatize, right? But acts on other receptors as well. These pathways that are different, acting on the same outcome to enhance muscle size and decrease fat mass, are synergistic. All right, let's talk about the third example, the additive, the more boring combinations. These would be like testosterone and oral Turinabol, right? So these are both just basically aromatizable, slightly for OT, because it is a 17-alpha alkylated androgen. It's also slightly 5-alpha reducible, I think. If not, doesn't really matter because testosterone just overpowers it anyway. And that's really what you're dealing with additive combinations like test and OT. They basically are just overpowered by the T. The testosterone is more potent. So kind of boring. You don't really see too much test and OT as a result. A lot of these things have been happened upon as good stacks by bodybuilders over the years. But, it's good to have an appreciation not only for why they work, but to come up with new ideas. That's what I'm all about. All right. So let's go back to the two paradigms, right? The two balancing considerations, tolerability versus efficacy, right? So we talked first about efficacy. Okay. Those combination strategies affect it. Let's talk next about tolerability. The tolerability, stacking. Major question people wonder is it more hazardous to our health to stack? No, the answer is definitely not. And I will explain to you why this is. So along the prongs of cardiovascular disease risk, male pattern baldness, joint pain, all of the maladies that you have to deal with AIs, obviously, right? If you're stacking agents together, you're just using test solo, you're going to need an AI. If you're stacking stuff, you don't necessarily need an AI. You can use anti-aromatizable steroids, you know what I mean? Things like Masteron or Primo. We all know practically that these work, and now there are good answers as to why. But so stacking obviously achieves that. There are other instances, though, too, to consider, right? So cardiovascular disease risk is actually reduced by a higher number of compounds. This was shown in the Harlem data. I'm trying to look for it. Let me pull it up. So the Harlem data showed that. Yeah, the Harlem trial data from the Netherlands showed that AAS number, the amount of different steroids used, was associated with lower left ventricular and diastolic and systolic volumes post-cycle. Okay? So the more AAS that were used, more compounds that were used, the safer it was. However, you should consider the fact that GH did the opposite. Okay, so combining GH with steroids is worse for your heart. Yeah. Okay, so other factors, obviously, I'll just go back and remind you that if you're taking test solo, you're going to have to take an AI at some point. If you go over 600 milligrams, you're definitely going to need an AI, and AI sides are terrible. All right, you just start playing whack-a-mole with these things. You're just going to have, bone pain if you're not using exemestane, worse cardiovascular disease risks, worse male pattern baldness risks. AIs cause all of those things, and so do androgens. So they're almost synergistic in their harms. All right. So let's move on to section number 3. Why T3 sucks for cutting. I hate T3. So basically T3 is potently catabolic. It preferentially reduces hypertrophied muscle. Okay, so the muscle that if you take 75 milligrams of T3 Cytomel daily for 2 weeks, it increases resting metabolic rate about 15%, adjusted for LBM. But it also preferentially decreases type 2A fibers the same amount, 15%. It's just basically making you catabolize muscle. The mechanism that T3 works via is similar to how DNP works, believe it or not. So it increases uncoupling protein to, like 1.7-fold at 75 micrograms a week. Yeah, I mean, 75 micrograms a week is a pretty hefty dose, to be honest with you, because it just shreds muscle and increases resting metabolic rate like 15%. It just does this by, increasing protein turnover, resulting in net protein loss. So basically, T3, I do not ever use it. I just think it's useless. It's not good for bodybuilding. We don't really, I mean, yeah, resting metabolic rate's great, but there are other ways to reduce fat preferentially. So why don't people just do that? And now we have the incretins, like the GLP, GLP-1 and GIP agonists and all those. So recruitide, everyone's talking about now, which is, good stuff too. They're all basically practically the same. I'll probably put out an answer or a discussion about that as well, but they're all practically the same. The only thing that I notice is that semaglutide definitely is more suppressive of appetite. And I honestly think it actually reduces fat mass a little bit better than the GIP function that actually is involved in fat metabolism and results in a little bit more fat retention, fat gain even. Basically, I would say semaglutide, Ozempic, is more for suppressing appetite and fat loss, more useful for bodybuilders, and even tirzepatide, slightly different. Tirzepatide is more for like blood glucose control. All right, so let's move on to the fourth section, and let's talk about the article that I just finished up for Miller, for Meso, about MENT. Basically the unique effects of AAS. And there are certainly some unique effects to MENT. And really, I didn't enjoy writing this article that much, guys, to be honest with you. This one, I mean, besides being just like tough to get my thoughts straight without being biased, because I've always disliked MENT, I mean, this is all unbiased. And it just makes me hate men even more, I mean, it's got unique effects, and basically its unique effects are that it's potently estrogenic via 7-alpha methylestradiol. It's got the most potent progestogenic effects of any androgen out there. Those two factors combine to give you gyno really, really badly. They both combine to give us bloating really, really badly. And hypertensive effects. It increases systolic blood pressure at like 2 milligrams a week. It's just, I don't like it. This is why. I'll go through it a little bit. All right. So basically, because of that 7-alpha methylestradiol aromatic product, MENT makes you bloat, makes you grow bitch tits. And it's not that anabolic. It's more because be more anabolic. Like a lot of people focus on like this transactivation data and like nuclear retention data from like the 80s and stuff that shows that MENT's really potent at the AR. And it is really potent at the AR. It's basically non-17-alpha methylated check drops, which are potent mebolerone. But the problem with it is that it's so progestogenic, and progestogenic action is anti-androgenic in its nature. That's what they use progestins for. They use progestins like I mentioned this drug, the Androcure, which is an anti-androgen and progestin medication that's used to treat androgen maladies like acne and prostate cancer in people. They give it to basically act as an anti-androgen. And MENT is like almost 30% as potent as it per milligram. You know what I mean? Like MENT just ends up being a shitty anabolic. I definitely get into like the what I call edematous effects as well, which are its bloating capacities, and it's very effective at making us bloat, which ties into, not only our fluid balance and sodium regulation, but also our cardiovascular control and blood pressure. It does this really by acting on our thirst, sodium appetite, making us eat more salt and making us drink more and fluids and retain water, bloats us up. It affects the renal tubuli of the kidneys. It acts via the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system and AVP and the CNS and PNS as well. So it's just like the nastiest shit out there, in my opinion. It increases pulse pressure, particularly. It thickens the blood, particularly by increasing hematocrit. It's just really intolerable and really basically go back to those tolerability versus efficacy trade-offs with MENT, right? It's got really terrible tolerability and really low efficacy. And it's just a useless drug for bodybuilders, in my opinion. All right, guys. So that's going to wrap it up for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. I'll keep trying to do these every week when I have some time. And you guys keep listening. All right. Take care.